Have you ever noticed that there are some things in life that we lose just as quickly as we find them? Have you ever tried to meditate before? Meditation is when you try to let go of all of your thoughts and just exist for a few moments. Just sit in pure existence without any thinking. If you've ever tried it, you know how hard it is. But if you sit there long enough and you have this really blessed moment, you may get to a point where there's no thinking at all. And if you're like me, what you will do in that moment is you will say, I think I've done it. I'm not thinking, which is a thought. And then it's gone. Yoga poses are like this too. Maybe you know some of the balancing poses in yoga. There's that one called tree pose, where you shift all of your weight onto one foot, and then you take the other foot and bring it up as high on your thigh as you can, and then you raise your arms like a tree. I would show you what it looks like, but I don't want you to be jealous. Well, as soon as you get that pose, then the wobbles start, and it's all over as soon as it begins. Faith is often like that too. We often lose it just as fast as we get it. That's what the story is about today. It takes up the story that is very familiar to us at a little bit of a later point. You know the story. The two disciples are walking along after Jesus has been crucified, and they're talking about how depressed they are and how awful it was, and then a stranger comes up and says, what are you guys talking about? And as they walk with him, they feel a deep sense of peace, but they don't know who he is. They don't know what it is. But then the stranger says, why don't we break some bread together? And he takes the bread, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he gives it to them. And in that moment, they recognize, this is Jesus. And at the moment they recognize him, he's gone. But they say, wasn't that amazing? Weren't our hearts burning inside of us when we were talking to that stranger? And then that's where the gospel picks up today. They've just seen him. Their faith is at this all-time high. And then what happens next? He actually shows up again, this time in his recognizable form. And they freak out. They lose their faith. They say, oh, it's a ghost. Who is this? They just had it. And then they lose it. Has that ever happened to you before? Where you have your faith, you think you've built it to a place where it's really going to sustain you, and then the next challenge, you feel like you've lost it? A lot of people have experienced some challenges since Easter time. Easter this year was beautiful. We had over 1,500 people come through the doors of our church, and if you were here for any of those celebrations, you might agree that something was just special this year. Things were just aligned. I don't know what it was, but a lot of people said this was the most beautiful Holy Week I can ever remember. And when we left here on Easter, we were all on a high. It was really beautiful, and we all left feeling great. And then the next day, we turned on the news. Early in the morning, on the day after Easter, there was a fire at the house of John Mamano in East Durham. And that fire took the lives of his 3 children and both of his parents and burned him terribly all over his body. He is still recovering at the Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. How could that be? What was your first reaction when you heard that story? A man who lost his 3 children and his parents in one morning. If your reaction was anything like mine, it was, God, how could you let this happen? How could this be? We were like the people in the story today. We had such faith, and then the next day, we were terrified, like we'd seen a ghost. So for us to know what we possibly could do in response to this kind of a tragedy, maybe we need to go back to the story and follow the thread of what Jesus did. What does Jesus say to them when they're terrified? He says, peace be with you. And then he asks, why are you troubled? Why do questions arise in your hearts? And I think that's the question that we ask ourselves. What happened to all the faith I had at Easter? Why isn't the faith that was so present just the other day, why wasn't it more durable? Why wasn't I able to touch it, to access it on the day when I needed it? How come sometimes I achieve a sense of peace, but then I lose it? Why isn't my peace more stable? Why is it so fleeting? How is it that when I watch the news and something bad comes on, the news troubles me more than my faith comforts me? A lot of us on Easter Day said, sure, Jesus is raised from the dead. I believe that. But then, the next day we asked, where is God in this, in East Durham? Maybe we need to change where we are looking for God in order to see God's presence. For a lot of us, when a disaster hits, we look for God in the problem, in the calamity. We look for God in the fire. We expect God to justify the devastation in some way. But that has never happened. God has never done that. And that's not where God is. God is not in the fire, not in the disaster. God is in the courage of those first responders who run toward the fire and not away from it. God is in the generosity and the caring of those doctors and nurses at Upstate Medical Center who are tenderly caring for this burned and grieving father. God is in that stab of pain in your heart right now, thinking about this story. God is there because that's your compassion. The fact that you're not running away from this pain is where God is present. Because you are, by feeling whatever you're feeling right now, you are participating in a small way in what they're going through. You're carrying some of their grief with them. It's very meaningful when you feel that discomfort over a story like this. God is in the GoFundMe page that people set up to help this family pay for the expense of 5 funerals. And I've put the information on that GoFundMe page at the bottom of the sharing spot in the bulletin. God is in every sign of comfort and kindness and goodness that is being shown to this family and everyone who is suffering. In fact, you yourself may be a sign of God's presence for them in the way that you pray for them, in any act of goodness that you show to them, in a note you might send or a donation you might give. When things are as dark as they are for this family right now, any bit of light that we can shine makes a big difference, makes things much brighter. Once you're on a spiritual journey like we're on, every single thing that happens in your life is homework. Everything is homework. So it is not meaningless that we celebrated our faith on Easter and then went through the agony of Monday and the news. It's not meaningless. It gives us an opportunity as people who are on a spiritual journey to ask, so do I believe this stuff or not? Am I going to let this be something that we talk about at church and then I walk away from until next week? Or am I going to apply this to everything in my life, to all of the news that I hear, to every tragedy that I face? This is the homework, to figure out how we can make our faith more durable, to apply it to real life, to use it as a part of our journey. When we hear about the kind of tragedy that people can endure, our minds get blown. We can't comprehend how Jesus could be raised from the dead and people could still die in tragedies like this. But that's because our mind is not the place to work this out. Our minds will never be able to calculate all of this. Our faith has to go deeper than just our brains. It needs to go into deeper parts of us. because we're going to keep facing that blend of light and darkness in the world. That's why every Easter, this candle is such an important symbol for us. This pillar that reminds us that there is a light that shines in the darkness, that is brighter than the darkness is dark, that will always shine, that we can always turn to. We experience both light and darkness. So often they're right up against each other. The highest high on Sunday, the lowest low on Monday. So that's why we need to ask God to help strengthen our faith so that we can learn to see at all times, even in the dark.